The book of Esther is about a beautiful young orphan Jewish girl, who hid her identity and became the queen of Persia. She lived in Shushan, which was one of the 4 royal residences for Persian emperors. Shushan was 150 miles north of the Persian Gulf. Daniel had visions in this location, and we will see later that Nehemiah served as cupbearer to King Ahasuerus' successor, King Artaxerxes I. Esther may not have ruled beside the king, but she was chosen as the one to be queen, after Queen Vashti could no longer come before King Ahasuerus. Vashti's royal position was given to Esther. After becoming queen, Esther struggles between 2 cultures, her Jewish culture, and the Persian culture, to decide what should be done to save the Jewish people from the hand of an evil man, who wants to destroy the Jews. The Lord is not mentioned in the book of Esther, and during this time, he seems so far away. His prophets were even silent during this time. Nevertheless, the Lord is forever faithful, he always keeps his promises, keeps his word, and had already been working to protect his people, even before the Jews were aware of it. Moreover, we can see his providence and sovereignty miraculously displayed in saving his people from a decree of Persia that was written to destroy his people, when the decree of the Medes and Persians could not be altered or changed. Esther's story spans during the time Ahasuerus, also called Xerxes in Greek, who reigned from 486 to 465 BC. He succeeds his father Darius I as ruler of the Persian Empire in 486 BC. Darius, the first, died in 486 BC, and his son Ahasuerus began to reign. In the beginning of Ahasuerus' reign, the Samaritans, who were adversaries of Judah and Benjamin, wrote to him with an accusation against the Jews for them to stop the building on the temple in Jerusalem. They were hoping that the king write a decree to stop the building, however, they never got an answer back from King Ahasuerus. Then Artaxerxes Longimanus succeeded his father Ahasuerus, Xerxes, and he became king of Persia, 464 to 424 BC, and they followed up in sending him a letter likewise. Now it happened in the days when King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes as he was also called, who reigned over 127 provinces extending from India to Ethiopia, sat on the throne of his kingdom in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants. The powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces stood before him when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. King Xerxes was the 4th and last king to arise in Persia, and he was far richer than the other 3 who were kings before him. He is the king mentioned in the vision of Daniel which was revealed to him in the 1st year of Darius the Mede. He was told by an angel, that after King Darius, there would be 3 more kings to arise, and the 4th king would be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he will stir up all against the realm of Greece. So when the 180 days were over, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were curtains with royal colors of white and blue linen fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods, marble pillars, and couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, white and black marble. Drinks were served in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. She gave a separate banquet for her guests. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, that is, when he was drunk, he desired to show off Queen Vashti, for she was exceedingly beautiful. He commanded 7 eunuchs who served in his presence, to bring Queen Vashti before him, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to be behold. However, Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, and when the eunuchs returned to the king without her, he was furious, and his anger burned within him. Then King Ahasuerus said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence, and who ranked highest in the kingdom, what should we do to Queen Vashti, according to law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs? Notice that is not Media and Persia anymore but Persia and Media. This is because Persia became stronger and more powerful than the Medes. It became known as the Persian Empire. Then one of King Ahasuerus' eunuchs, Memucan, answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes, and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. The queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes. When they report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day the noble women of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. So there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti will come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree which he will make is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. The reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house, and speak in the language of his own people. So Queen Vashti was dethroned. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him saw how he missed Vashti and hated being separated from her, and knowing that the law could not admit reconciliation. Therefore the king's servants said to him, Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Hegai the king's eunuch, custodian of the women. Moreover, let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. In Shushan the citadel, the capital city, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away. Mordecai had brought up his uncle's daughter Hadassah, this was her name before it was changed to Esther, for her father and mother were both dead, and Mordecai raised her as his own daughter. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. Hadassah is the Hebrew name of Esther, while Esther is her Persian name. We see that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were all given Babylonian names by the Chaldean eunuchs. When Jews lived in regions different from their own land, their names were usually changed to a name of that culture. Jews would keep their sacred Hebrew name, and be given a secular name understandable to the culture where they live outside their own land. It was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel, under the custody of Hegai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace, into the care of Hegai the custodian of the women. Out of 400 women, she was the most beautiful of them all, and the elegance of her countenance drew attention principally upon her. Now Esther pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the beast place in the house of the women. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had told her not to reveal it. However, it was every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters, to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Each young woman's turn came to go in to King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months' preparation, according to the regulations of the women, for they were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes, and preparations for beautifying women. Once prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening, she went, and in the morning, she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now when the turn came for Esther to go in to the king, she requested only what Hegai the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. Therefore, Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. Then Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus, into his royal palace, in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than he loved all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so he set the royal crown upon her head, and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. Therefore, Esther became the Persian king's wife without her making known to him that she was a Jew. When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. A Jew by birth, Barnabas, the servant of one of the eunuchs, knew of the conspiracy and brought the matter to Mordecai. Mordecai told it to Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. When an investigation was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both Bigthan and Teresh, the doorkeepers, were hanged on the gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. But no reward was given to Mordecai, but his name was written in the record, and he was invited to stay in the palace, as a close friend. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hamdatha the Agagite, an Amalekite by birth, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded that such honor should be paid to him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" Now it happened, when they spoke to him daily and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman, to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. However, he hated to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Haman's ancestors were Amalekites, and in the past, they hated the Jews because the Jewish nation destroyed the Amalekites. Therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, all the people of Mordecai, for Haman naturally had a deep hatred for the Jewish people. In the 1st month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast lots before Haman to establish the best time to destroy the Jewish people, to determine the day and the month, and it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, their laws are different from all other people, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king, to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work, to bring it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hamdatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money and the people are given to you, to do with them as seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the 1st month, and a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, for King Ahasuerus had 127 provinces, from India to Ethiopia. A copy of the decree was given to all the officials of all the people, to every province according to its script, and to every people in their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus it was written, and sealed with the king's signet ring. And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. A copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all people, that they should be ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan the citadel. Meanwhile, the king and Haman spent their time in feasting together, drinking and enjoying good wine, but the city of Shushan was in chaos. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai, to learn what and why this was. Therefore, Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hathach, and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king, who has not been called, he has but one law, and that is to put all to death. Except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. Now it was a law made that none of the king's own people could approach the king unless he was called by him. The king sat on his throne surrounded by men with axes in order to punish anyone who approached him without being called. However, the king held a golden scepter in his hand, and if he approved of one approaching him, he would hold out his scepter for him to touch, and then the one who approached would live. Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, and gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." The famous 5 words of Esther, "If I perish, I perish," were remembered all down through the ages of time. Therefore, Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. For 3 days, supplications were made to God by all the Jewish people who dwelt in the provinces of the Persian king. Mordecai, Esther, and her maids did likewise. Now it happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request?" "It will be given to you, up to half the kingdom." Then Esther answered, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It will be granted you. What is your request, up to half the kingdom? It will be done." Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this: if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Now Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart, but when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and Mordecai did not stand or tremble before him, he was furious and filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, "Besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her, along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, then go merrily with the king to the banquet." The thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. That night, the king could not sleep, for the Lord God took his sleep from him. The Lord gave him the desire to spend his night to look over the official records of the events of the Persian Empire, and the records of his own actions. So he commanded one to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles to him, and they were read before the king, and it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman came to the court much early than usual. He had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servants said to him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." The king said, "Let him come in." Then Haman came in, and the king asked him, "What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" Haman, supposing the king was speaking about him, suggested that which he would want done to him. Then Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, so will it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." It never fails, it is always at the right time, the Lord God intervenes and starts his work in resolving and reversing everything Haman, his family and friends had plotted against the Jews and Mordecai. It was nothing but the hand of the Lord who made the king restless, and nothing but the Lord who put on the king's heart to search out the book of the records of the Chronicles. King Xerxes may not have even known why he could not sleep, or why in the night he wanted the records of the Chronicles read to him. Yes, just at the very moment Haman was entering the court of the king's palace, the king had found the incident where his two doorkeepers were plotting to kill him, and Mordecai reporting it, so that the king would be aware of it. It was no one but the Lord who had a hand in this. Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew who sits within the king's gate." leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, "So will it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate. But Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife, Zeresh, and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men, and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him but will surely fall before him. Were not they so right?" This proves that the Persians knew the God of Israel, and that it was nothing impossible for him. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came, and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet, which Esther had prepared. The king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and on the second day, at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It will be granted you. And what is your request, up to half the kingdom? It will be done." Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden, but Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will you also assault the queen while I am in the house?" Haman could say nothing else. Sabuchadas, the eunuch, came in also to accuse Haman and told them that Haman had built a gallows at his house prepared for Mordecai. Then the king said, "Hang him on it." Therefore, they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite, and the scheme, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king, and said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight and the thing seems right to the king and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hamdatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "Indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews, as you please, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring no one can revoke." So the king's scribes were called at that time, in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written, according to all that Mordecai commanded, to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. By these letters the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions, on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who rode on royal horses went out, hastened, and pressed on by the king's command. And the decree was issued in Shushan the citadel. Therefore, Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. It was this unexpected turn of events that moved many of the people of the land to want to be closer to the Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. On the 13th day, 12th month of Adar, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all the people. All the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work, helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. So the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. In Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. In addition, the 10 sons of Haman the son of Hamdatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan the citadel was brought to the king. Then the king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It will be done." Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." Esther wanted the dead sons of Haman to be hanged on the gallows. This sent a message and a warning to all who planned evil against the Jews: they would be annihilated. So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged the dead bodies of Haman's 10 sons on the gallows. The Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men at Shushan, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This had happened on the 13th day. On the 14th and the 15th day of the month of Adar, they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. The Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews, near and far, who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hamdatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast lots, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, they called these days Purim, after the name Pur, meaning lot, the lot that was cast to destroy the Jews. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter, and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year, according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. Therefore, the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now all the acts of his power and his might, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him in the kingdom of the Persians and Medes, holding the second highest rank in the land, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all his countrymen. If this video has been a blessing to you, please like, subscribe, and share. Thanks.